So I am in the unenviable position of being the last speaker of the day. And usually that's a situation that calls for brevity. Now the good news is you're not going to see a lot of equations and deep complex formulas in this presentation, so forgive me for that, but I couldn't hang in that level if I wanted to be honest with you. So what I'm going to do is talk about experiences I've had in green tech industry and pose one problem that what I call my nagging issues file around long-term issues we all have to deal with. But they are from the fact that I did work at Tesla for a couple of years, as well as Spaniel for the last year and a half. So I've got some smart grid as well as some EV experience to draw from. So we'll get into it. Okay, I can assume that we all know what this is. Yeah? Show of hands? Pretty good. Okay, this is the Tesla Roadster. $109,000 carbon fiber bodied, actually surprisingly small EV that is 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. Completely engineered and developed by a team up in San Carlos, California, with some, I guess, licensing of things from AeroVironment and one other company. But terrifically engineered, fun vehicle, based loosely on the structural model of the Lotus Esprit. And the Lotus car, as an aluminum frame structure, it was ideal for the application here because it was lightweight, it was cheap to build, it was a low volume vehicle, et cetera. So Tesla's now shipped about 1,000 of these Roadsters, and they are gearing up for what's next. So show of hands, how many people know what this is? Ah, very few. This is Tesla's styling buck or styling concept vehicle for what they call Model S. When I was at Tesla, which was from all of 2007 and all of 2008, I was in charge of this program. It's called White Star. White Star is intended to be a family sedan, high performance, but appealing to a much broader audience. Where you might sell a few thousand Roadsters a year, the idea on White Star is to sell 10 to 20,000 sedans a year. And as you can imagine, the design challenges around designing a sedan versus a sports car are significantly different. Sports car enthusiasts care about performance. They care about styling and beauty. They don't really care about range. It's a toy. They take it out, they play with it on the weekends, they embarrass Ferraris, embarrass Porsches, they bring it back and plug it in. But with a sedan, you're trying to appeal to an audience, including soccer moms, that have to want to put their family in that vehicle. And so you're looking at much higher thresholds for safety, for reliability. Can I count on it? What's the functionality? I need 14 cubic feet of trunk space, so don't put the damn battery pack in the trunk. It got to be a very complex design challenge in that regard. And we'll talk some more about what those issues are. So, and that's sort of an entree to the EV industry. The fundamental problem in designing EVs is that internal combustion engine vehicles carry 20 gallons of gasoline plus or minus. That's 700 kilowatt hours of energy. They efficiently use maybe 20% of it. And when you throw in the mass from the fuel tank, from the fuel line systems, the exhaust system, the pumps, et cetera, it's about 200 pounds. Well, we had 1/10 the energy, 5 times the weight in the battery pack for the Tesla vehicle. Arguably, you don't need a battery that big, but what Tesla was shooting for is about a 300-mile range, because what they're trying to do is make a no-compromises vehicle where you don't have to apologize or think differently about the way you use the transport. As we'll talk later on, that may or may not be a valid construct, but nevertheless, that was sort of the design strategy. So this presented huge problems. The net result of all this is you've got to understand where all the energy is going. And where it's all going, besides just moving the car down the road, are all these different subsystems. So you've got, for example, brake systems. I'm not talking about regeneration from kinetic energy back to electricity. I'm talking about the fact that on most brake systems on the cars today, they actually have brake drag as you're driving down the road. Because the way a caliper brake works is you've got a hydraulic piston that pushes it in, and then it releases the pressure but doesn't pull it back out. And so what will happen is that those pads are sitting on top of the rotor, and under the right conditions, kiss the rotor. When that occurs, you're losing what we modeled was hundreds of watts of power going into brake drag. We had to go find brakes that were designed to roll back when you release the pressure on the pedal. That was not common in the industry several years ago. HVAC systems, air conditioning, which typically runs off of the belt for the vehicle, the serpentine belt, as well as the power steering. Air conditioning systems can suck as much as 5 kilowatts of power. We typically modeled about a 2 kilowatt load and capability for the car, but that's an awful lot of energy. So we went and got into heat pump technology and looked at that as a methodology for reducing it using COP. All told, these systems can add up to about a 10 kilowatt load in the vehicle. Now, when you look at the energy available and you want to use it efficiently, it got very scary around, look at all the things that are going into the ancillary systems. And you could lose as much as 20 to 30% of the raw energy sitting in the battery pack going into the ancillary devices rather than into the powertrain itself. And that got to be a big deal. So, along with that are all these other dependencies. The biggest factor in all of this is weight. So the driving profile is set by the EPA, and they precisely defined a city and highway profile that says you will travel at this speed, at this grade, for this long, and then change it to this parameter. They're trying to emulate what they think is typical driving conditions. And as you probably know, they upgraded this a couple of years ago because the previous models weren't emulating real world conditions at all, and what people saw on the sticker was nothing like what they're really achieving in life. And that's changed quite a bit, and I think they've improved it a lot. But so you've got a model to work with in terms of the profile. Well, that worked fine, except that the real world says you want to drive from San Francisco to Lake Tahoe or from LA to Mount Baldy, take your pick. Those long hill climbs draw a tremendous amount of power requirement because of the weight factor. That power drives more cooling capacity. The cooling capacity drives more energy requirement. The battery pack gets bigger, it weighs more, and you've got this spiral up, right? Which is exactly the wrong direction. You want to spiral down. Amory Lovins is somebody who can talk about that if you haven't heard that name before. So weight became a big issue. We targeted trying to hit 3,400 pound curb weight with a sedan, and we were pounding and pounding and pounding to get down below 3,700. And that included about a 950 pound battery pack, which was going to give us about a 270 mile, 280 mile range at the time. So these dynamic conditions, along with the sort of critical stable condition of weight, are other factors that have to be considered when you're talking about how do you figure out the energy profile for an electric vehicle. So the first problem in modeling this was that, quite frankly, many of these subsystems were not understood in the industry. We started working with one of the big three in Detroit, and this is back in late 2007. And we're talking to them about, can we use some of your subsystems? And they said, sure, let's go figure this out. And we're terrific. Now we've got real car engineers we can talk to about how all these things worked. Well, they didn't really understand what the energy losses were for some of these subsystems. Example, power steering. Power steering is modeled as a power requirement. And in fact, when you're at low speed and you're turning the wheel, it takes a tremendous amount of power to do that. It's surprising. At highway speeds, when you're not turning it very much, not nearly as much. So they were worried about the power load and that impact on the internal combustion engine, but not on the overall energy profile losses to the car. That was something we had to care about a lot. Another example is the waste heat problem. Internal combustion engines make gobs of waste heat. Electric motors don't. So when it came time to put heating in the cabin, we actually had to stick a coil inside the cabin to heat the car. And it just drove us crazy that we're actually going to put a device in just to use energy to heat the car rather than some other system that could do it for us. It was a real problem mentally for us. Clearly, the conventional vehicle manufacturers don't have that issue. You'll find, I think, today that most hybrids, in fact, do have the heating coils inside, and the way you can tell is instant heat. So you're not waiting for the drivetrain to heat up before you get heat in the cabin. It's actually a nice feature now. So there are some things that have been learned here that have been extrapolated over to the rest of the vehicle community. In particular, electric power steering is one you're going to see, I think, from here on out, which will actually save quite a few percentage points on fuel economy. Second problem, not all the metrics were the same. So we talked to vendors about various subsystems, and they'd say, well, this one consumes this much horsepower, needs this much horsepower. This one has this many kilowatt hours, et cetera. It's not this is a hard problem to solve. It just speaks to the fact that the industry hadn't gotten used to the idea of looking at the vehicle as a total energy system. They were used to looking at subsystems and quoting performance around subsystems that were sort of conventional. So there's a translation exercise to go through. The third one, and this is actually the hardest, and it led to the most of the modeling activity, was that linear models for how these cars and subsystems perform were not very accurate, were not sufficiently complex enough. There are obviously second and third order effects between subsystems. The way that the powertrain would heat up the power electronics box, and the battery pack would heat as it dissipated power to them, and the cross correlation and the cross feeds between those are all second and third order effects that we could not have interpreted or anticipated early on in the design of the vehicle. So as we went throughout, we had to constantly refine the models. Well, the original model for the Roadster was in fact just a set of spreadsheets. Martin Eberhard, the founder of the company, developed an increasingly complex set of spreadsheets that were time sliced to be able to figure out what's happening at every 10th of a second, or every 100th of a second, excuse me. So we used that for about 3 to 4 years before J.B. Strobel, the CTO, had a team sufficiently competent enough to be able to reproduce the complex equations and do the MATLAB work to be able to figure out where the performance was really going. And in fact, I would estimate that the original models, by the time I got, they were probably 70%, 75% accurate to the real world experience, where JB's models later on are probably approaching about 95%. You're not going to get to 100%, but at 95, we felt pretty good about the results we were seeing. So the message from the vehicle EV side before we leave this topic. It's a complex set of interdependencies. It's a lot of sophisticated modeling technique. These are not easy problems. And the neat thing is that even though that's still true in the gasoline industry, the EV side is actually on the cutting edge of it, and they're still figuring out these interdependencies. So there's still quite a bit of work going on in the EV space in that regard. One last slide about EVs. The other big problem, I called Martin and said, I'm going to give this talk. What would you want to posit as the big issue? He said it's battery selection. Batteries, batteries, batteries. You've got all these different chemistries. You've got different form factors. Each chemistry has its own life cycle curve. They've got their own cycles curve. They've got their own degradations based upon age and based upon thermal management. And so it's a really complex set of variables to pick first a cell and then pick a battery pack design. In terms of the system design, you're trying to cram these things into spaces. And part of the reason Tesla used a small form factor cell, it's a little bit bigger than a AA, it's called an 18650, was that you could kind of treat it as a fluid problem. You could shape the battery pack the way you wanted to put it in available space. From a manufacturing standpoint, I never liked it. I liked bigger cells because it's easier to integrate those into an overall system, and it's less scary from a manufacturing process standpoint. You have to wire bond these 7,000 batteries together, and that was a nightmare. But it did give them a kind of a fluid structure. So big challenge around battery system design and battery cell selection, and that's ongoing. Now, the latest and greatest discussion is about iron phosphate lithium cells. So this will go on and on and on as people over time figure out new chemistries, and perhaps based upon availability of materials, chemistries that work for the application. All right, moving on. Smart grid. So this is now the Fat Spaniel experience. And smart grid has been discussed in this form as very much a utility-centric sort of power management, power availability sort of problem. And I don't deny that. It initially started as demand management around power availability, advanced metering infrastructure, automatic meter reading, that sort of thing. But I'm going to posit a different definition, because what's happened is that as they've started to talk about this information network around power, all kinds of people have popped up out of the woodwork and come up with different ideas for how they can connect to that network. So my definition, and I think it's worked well for Fat Spaniel, the networking of all devices that either produce or consume resources. I say resources instead of electricity because it's just true for natural gas or for water or waste streams as it is for electricity. It is certainly being built out for electricity first, but you're going to find smart meters for natural gas right around the corner, and I would imagine for water as well. So when you look at it this way and think through the smart grid and what it can do, you get to just an explosion of different ideas and opportunities. Why is it important? Well, bottom line, resource optimization. At the user level, you don't want to use more than you have to. You're looking for ways to reduce consumption. At the utility level, you're looking for a better asset utilization and more profitability. So those, I think, these are all pretty clear signals around why you'd want to go down this road. Apologize for the eye chart, but this, I think, is a better description of smart grid than the original graphic. What this does is by layer talk about what's happening and sort of communicates the complexity factor. The bottom layer is power. So whether it's whatever resource it might be, you have users, you've got producers, and the interrelationship between the actual thing being transferred back and forth. The blue layer above that's the communications layer. So you've got home area networks, you've got wide area networks, you've got RF mesh networks, you've got point-to-point, you've got multi-point networks, you've got LANs. All these different communication schemes are used to transfer information about the resource between the thing producing it or consuming it and the people that want to analyze it. The green layers above that are all applications. You have applications for meters, for how do you collect the data. You've got to define standards for what does a power meter read? What are the data standards? You've got applications for analyzing, and I'll show a Fat Spaniel example in a second. So there are a tremendous number of applications that can be created that have value in the smart grid industry by helping people understand how their devices work and what to do with them. When you think through that, somebody asked the question last night, gee, where's the next big job thing? I actually think it's in smart grid. The ability to create software that people can use to manage resources is going to be huge, and frankly already is. The kinds of data, production or consumption from devices. When you've got a PV system, you want to know, well, okay, I got so many kilowatt hours today, but what was the insolation on that day? What was the irradiance at noon? So you want to get the environmental data around it. What was the temperature of the cells? What was the ambient temperature? A lot of this is because they want to analyze what can that device do, or who's got the best panel on the market, who's got the best inverter on the market. The biggest arguments going on around this stuff is who owns this data. The manufacturers don't want the monitoring companies to own the data because it may say things about the manufacturer they don't want people to know. The utilities recognize there's a lot of value in the data, and anybody who's creating data is hanging on to it, thinking I'm going to be able to sell it at some point. And that's one of Fat Spaniel's value premises, is they're going to be able to sell these data sets to people, and that's why investment folks, venture capitalists, are getting involved in smart grid. How do you use the data? Well, control devices, turning them on and off. Payment systems, you have to have a revenue grade meter. Joe and I were looking at the installations here on campus at West earlier, and you've got a revenue grade chip that's actually measuring the information coming from the panels on current transducers. The way that Fat Spaniel works it is they have a revenue grade meter, and why that's important is if you wanted to have a PV farm and sell energy back to Southern California Edison, you'd have to have a classified registered revenue grade meter in which to do it. So you've got to hit a certain threshold of accuracy and quality, and it's sort of sub 1% data accuracy around the quality of the power. Payment systems, analysis of performance, site selection. So now you can get third-party databases of environmental data down to sub-kilometer resolution. If you take that and you can say, I've got a 1 megawatt plant I'm going to build. I got to figure out where to put it. I'd like to know what the microclimate looked like in this corner of Barstow, California versus Mendocino versus Redding, whatever. The point is you want to be able to take that data and use that for analysis around future investments. And that's a big part of the value of the database. And then from a maintenance standpoint, people want to be notified how their system's performing. If you've got PV panels on your roof and you don't have a monitoring system, you don't know what they're doing. So you can go out to the inverter and look on the little display and it says, okay, great, I'm putting out power right now. And that's fine for the residential customer. If you are a commercial producer of electricity, you want to know what's happening on that sucker about every 15 minutes. Because if something starts to go south, you want to predict it, you want to get ahead of it, and swap out the inverter so it doesn't go down. Wash the panels because you start to see a degradation rate. So everybody is trying to squeeze every last amount of energy they can out of these systems, because at the end of the day, that's the only way they're going to be able to make them pay for themselves and make a profit. In order for that to happen, they need pretty tight controls over what's happening and measuring the systems. So what are the challenges in smart grid deployment? Massive data quantity. FERC is Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They estimate 140 million meters by 2020, and that's going to produce 100 petabytes of data per year in the United States alone. 100 petabytes is about 1/10 of the global volume of data produced annually now, of all data. I mean, all information, right? It's a huge quantity. And that's just in the US. So it's 300 million people. You multiply that by a factor of 3 for developed countries. So that's one answer. You've got a global perspective from all 7 billion of us that'll probably 7.5 by 2020. And you can see where the data loads are really tremendous. Here's an example from Fat Spaniel's current information. I got this last week from Brett Francis, the VP of Engineering. They're monitoring 3,100 sites, and mostly these are photovoltaic sites where they've got solar panels on the rooftop, or they are commercial grade solar panels where you might have hundreds or thousands of panels in one system. They also do some wind turbines, not too many. Most wind turbines are expensive enough. They come with their own what's called SCADA systems for monitoring them and controlling them. Solar hot water and building demand. So some of what people are buying these systems for is to find out how much energy is Harvey Mudd consuming now. So that's a building demand problem set that maintenance managers and facilities heads are trying to figure out. They have 220 megawatts under management, and that's producing 8.5 million packets a day. And to date, the 4.5 billion records you see here, that's actually tripled in the last 6 or 7 months. What's happened there is the complexity of the systems they're managing has grown substantially as they get bigger commercial environments. And so they're getting a lot more data out of those systems. Now, Fat Spaniel has changed from selling software and hardware, where we're actually assembling the hardware monitoring systems and selling them to people that install them in the field, to becoming a full software company. So now all their services are offered over the net, what's called software as a service. That adds its own complexities to performance questions. So rather than have a server somewhere that's got this system installed at Harvey Mudd, you just go to a website and the data is transferred over the net to Fat Spaniel's database and they manage that for you. So what are the challenges in smart grid deployment? Data mining. It's a classic DBA issue. That's not new in and of itself. Database efficiency in terms of architecture, in terms of data security, in terms of algorithm efficiency, all those sorts of things are true. But you add to that this additional complexity of multiple databases where you're trying to, say, marry up production information here with environmental information from this database over there, perhaps with some consumption someplace else. And they're all temporal data. It's all time-sliced data. So you've got to be able to match up the time buckets accurately, and the definitions of what's in each bucket have to be identical. So what's been a big part of this challenge is getting standards around the definition of different data buckets. NIST, National Institute of Standards, has released over 100 different data standards for smart grid in the last 3 or 4 months. And they think there may be 25% of the way through that conversation, 100 different standards. Interestingly, what we found was the amount of data wasn't the biggest challenge for Fat Spaniel. It was the number of people accessing the data and what they were doing with it. So users that would go in and mine information and analyze that information and want to present it back, those are the things that created the most load in the system, the most efficiency problems for the overall environment. It's not the data volume itself. So message number 2 in this discussion is database architecture, algorithm design, how you handle massive quantities of data, how you efficiently store it and sift through it to get useful information is a big opportunity in the industry. And it's really true for all industries with SaaS capability, where they're trying to offer services over that. And more you're finding software companies doing that, where you don't have to load it on site, you just use the net as a sort of transport mechanism. All right, that was topic number 2. Number 3 is a little different. Oh, sorry, last slide on this thing. Here are some resources. Brett offered to talk to anybody about data modeling if people want to discuss it, so I put his email address up here in the developer portal. Fat Spaniel actually has 200 independent developers creating different applications and different kinds of devices to monitor that work on their platform ultimately they'll become a middleware company that their platform is used to sort of shepherd data in and out of the database. All right. Economics. So this is again from my nagging issues file. When I started going back to get my environmental science master's, I quickly came to the conclusion that we've got a major break between what I call free market economy or Western civilization economies and sustainability. I mean, fundamentally at a large system level, we have limitations, and yet the economies don't perceive life that way. They perceive life as infinite growth, and they reward life as infinite growth. And the question here is, how do you reconcile them? So this is a different topic altogether than what's happening in industry per se. My premise is this. Natural models are closed systems. Here's the water cycle from USGS. Here's the carbon cycle, right? It's a recognition that it's a closed environment. And I think at the global model level, what you can say is it's a closed system from a material standpoint. Yes, there's space dust, but let's discount that. It's a steady state model from an energy standpoint, where you've got so much insulation coming in and so much radiation going out, and hopefully the idea would be at steady state. Obviously, the whole climate change argument is it's not as steady state as we need it to be, and that's a challenge. But fundamentally, that's what we're trying to accomplish. This is a classic economics model. I don't know how many people have had economics classes, but fundamentally, this model says it's a supply-demand curve. As demand changes, then prices and quantities reset to an equilibrium point so that the supply side and the demand side balance out. The problem with this is there's not an assumption that there's a limitation to the quantity of resources available, that it can keep going on. Markets reward growth. Markets don't reward steady state behavior. They don't reward taking things down. Now you can argue at the company level, companies come and go, and that's fine, but look at the overall market. Are we happy as a nation when the GDP is flat or negative? Are we happy when the stock market starts to slide a bit? We're not. I mean, there's a human nature factor to this around we like expansion, we like things deep going up and to the right. And I think we'd all pretty easily understand that that may be inconsistent with sustainability. So the consequences of all of that, of course, more goods, consumption, et cetera, near-term quality of life, and obviously the near term is a caveat. This is a slide, and I did have a graph, here you go, of CO2 emissions per capita, and I know you can't read any of it, by country. So this is 150 countries tracked by UN climate, and this data is from the IEA. The axis on the right, on the left, excuse me, is tons of CO2 per capita, going from the 10 tons per capita per year up to higher numbers. And then all these 150 countries across the bottom. United States is 19 tons per capita per annum of CO2. Canada is 17. The European Union is 7.8, call it around 8. China is 4.5. And China has in fact almost tripled in the last 5 or 6 years as they have gone on a huge infrastructure building spree and brought up coal plants like crazy. India is 1.18. Africa is, as a continent, is 0.92. What scientists think is sustainable is 3 tons of CO2 emissions per capita per year. So obviously I'm trying to make the point that we're not on a sustainable pattern here. And you can't blame the underdeveloped countries for wanting to develop and gain all the amenities and luxuries that the developed countries have. We'd want to do that too if we were in their place. But the question is, what do you do about it? Oh, the ones on the left of the United States were Arab countries that were very, very oil-centric in their economy. I think Qatar, it was the farthest one on the left. By the way, this graph doesn't include all volume of people by country, right? So if you've got more people in bigger countries, India and China are further down the road. If you normalized it by total people on the planet, there would be a much steeper fall off and a much longer tail on the curve.
So just to get us some sense of what this cutoff means, what countries at this threshold cutoff?
I don't even think I can read it. It's not wrote. You can't even read it at that point. Probably some idea. South Latin countries, they're not going to be developed countries. All the developed countries are going to be 8 and up. So Latin countries, Southeast Asia countries, people in that space. I forget where Japan was. I want to say they're up around 11, but I'm not sure of that. This graph, another eye chart, pretty cool though. What it shows you is the availability of various precious metals, which are this is the limits part of the conversation, right? And this shows it to you in years. So I added the rings where the red ring is 50 years, the purple one is 100, and 1,000 years is out there in the blue. The belief is that the availability of known reserves of these precious metals that we require to run industry, to run our economies, by and large, evaporate within 50 years. And then out there at the 1,000-year mark, if you're curious, that's aluminum. So that's what that's about. Now, here's the problem. This has been stated for at least the last 40 years that we're about to run out. So a monumental work by Paul Ehrlich called Limits to Growth, in which he said, we're going to run out of these things in the next 20 years, and it didn't happen. So the challenge here is, are there, of course there are ultimate limits, but are we close to them or not? History and economics say we're really not, because we haven't really found them yet. So while, yes, we do say that there are limits to these reserves, it isn't clear that that's a definitively true statement. Whether we're close to the limits or not, I think what is undeniable is that we're close to the set points, or that we are modifying the set points. And what I mean by set point is there's sort of the status of the global climate. So as global temperature increases, it leads to all these unintended negative consequences that we've got to go deal with. You could make the same statement about water distribution, about food, et cetera. So we are, whether you want to call it terraforming or some other social engineering, we are changing the set points of where things sit on the planet, and you've got to go deal with that. So how do you reconcile these two things? First and foremost, it's an ethical debate. Do we have the ability to change the set points and or limits on the planet through action or inaction? If by inaction meaning, if we knew something was going to happen, we could fix it, should we? This is an ongoing debate. I don't think it gets solved quickly. I'm not sure it ever gets solved. A comment was made last night that these sorts of issues managed by governments and policy are really complex. I don't think they're complex. There's just an infinite number of factions that want to have their own answer to it. And since they all have their own sovereign ability to say, here's what I want to do, there's no mechanism for reconciliation. So I'm not sure this gets solved, but I think that in terms of a list of what do you do, trying to get an ethical framework is probably on the top of the list. This is where the math comes in. What are the interrelationships between the natural systems and the economic systems? Those models don't well exist today, and I would imagine are very difficult to create in the context of the natural systems are very complex, multivariable sorts of issues to go resolve. So the modeling's hard, but I think work has to be done in that space to be able to provide scientific data to policymakers about what do we do about it. So ultimately, it has to result in either national or transnational policy around what are the limits to our ability to change set points and consume resources. That's all. Willpower. So that was my sort of issue I wanted to raise to you and think about. Is it real and is it solvable? But again, this hit me in the face as I started working on the environmental masters, and people kept talking about limitations and availability of supply. And I thought, I just came out of industry where up and to the right is always good. You always go up and to the right in all levels. And so that's what gives us the Western civilization carbon footprints that are 6 times the sustainable level. Resources on this topic. Interestingly enough, as I did investigation on this, there's a man named Herman Daly who's an economist who's been talking about this actually for quite some time, but he's been kind of a lone voice. There is now an International Society of Ecological Economics, and there's 2 branches of economics that are touching on this. One is ecological economics, the other is environmental economics. The way they describe themselves is Environmental economics is economists that are trying to get the environment fitted into their model. Ecological economists are looking at the ecology as an overall system with the economy inside of it. So it's got to fit within. I think the ultimate better answer is the latter, where you've got to deal with the fact that we're all on this planet together and have to deal with the consequences. But it's a good place to go look for more information. So my observations. One, there are modeling challenges in every business, whether it's financial or technical. Clearly not every challenge is going to be worthy of a Harvey Mudd individual who's got major horsepower to be able to figure out tough, complex models. But there's an awful lot to do out there. And I don't think you have to go look for, gee, where is there action? There's action everywhere. Discussion came up last night about how do I find a job in the green tech industry? And I think some of the answers were right on. A, find your passion. B, get involved, whether it's either volunteerism or going to conferences or connecting and networking with people. Ultimately, I'll tell you from 30 years down the road, networking is a really important tool set because it connects you to people that have problems to go solve. And as you discuss it with them and they gain confidence and trust and faith in you, you get to go solve them. That's what consultants do. And so an awful lot of the time as a consultant is spent marketing and finding out who's got problems to go solve and convincing them you can help them solve it. Alternative energy tends to deal more with power and energy, sort of currency, so to speak. And so understanding those technologies, the markets, the terminology, that's all very helpful. So learn more and more about that space and become very familiar with it. You can create very complex models. No doubt that a vehicle is a very complicated beast, like an aircraft. And so being able to model that whole thing accurately can be a huge crunch. You can also solve many problems with simple linear models and spreadsheets. And what I said earlier, we operated Tesla for several years on a set of spreadsheets about the way the Roadster would behave, and it served our purposes well up to a point. So it's really a value judgment about when and how you deploy different kinds of techniques, what you need and when you need it. I think it's fairly straightforward. Real world problems just aren't linear. They are, if you really want to get them right, they're going to be complicated. Which leads me to my last point. I wish I had paid more attention to differential equations. Okay, my last slide is a shout out to the Mudders in the audience. I apologize to the non-Mudders. For the folks that don't go here, we don't have fraternities at Harvey Mudd. We have dorms. And I want to run my colors up the flagpole.
Of fluorescence, again, because of energy efficiency and everything else, replacing incandescent bulbs. Are there any technological areas where we're hoping for that kind of a substitution that will greatly improve our energy use?
Yeah, the answer is return on investment. The ozone hole got fixed not just because a lot of people cared, it's because Dow had a ready replacement to get rid of the refrigerant. And so they knew they could make a lot of money by supporting this. So in fact, the free market economy, solving problems that come up and finding reputable ways to go do that and make money at it, it works. It absolutely works. Now, let's look at solar panels, where as yet they haven't crossed the threshold of grid parity. So I do believe you've got to have some policy to support things that seem to make sense and need to go forward. Germany's solar installations and Denmark and wind are great examples of how that's occurred. You've got to pick the right horses to run on and make sure you've got some amount of policy in place to help them unlevel the playing field.
Well, the policy is usually government policies. Are you thinking economic overwhelming evidence could do it?
Economic overwhelming evidence will almost always win, but without that, you need some government policy to help.
Venture capital.
unlevel. Interesting comment about the VC. So I was talking to a VC last week, and he said, we're expecting a collapse in the VC industry from whatever it was, 700 or 800 VCs in the country down to 300 or 400 over the next 2 or 3 years, just due to the collapse in the bubble. I think the VCs will pull back and be quite a bit more rigorous around where they put their money going forward, which is not unlike what happened after the dot-com bubble burst back in the early 2000s. So we'll go through another cycle of that. But ultimately, there are VCs that are very interested in sustainability and green technology and are putting their money where their mouth is, and there are multiple billion-dollar funds behind that. What you'll see is probably the big fish will survive, and the smaller fish will either get eaten up or just fall away.
I was wondering if you had any experience of mathematicians trying to break into solving these practical problems, because from my experience, a lot of typical math degrees teach you how to solve all sorts of problems, but not really real-world problems. So there's a kind of change in skills and attitude and so on that would go from having a math degree towards dealing with any of these kind of issues. So I was just wondering if you'd encountered people who were going through this.
I don't interview people and understand their resume around, are you a mathematician or an engineer, when I meet them in the company, right? A lot of them get hired. Certainly we hire fewer mathematicians than we do mechanical engineers at a company like Tesla Motors, but there are multiple mathematicians. There are people with math backgrounds. I think what ends up happening in reality is bright people that have technical skills get applied to a problem, find that they can figure that problem out, and that kind of takes them on to the next problem. The discipline you came from doesn't matter a whole lot in industry in the entrepreneurial sense, as long as you can solve the next problem. And that's what I see happening. We find people from all walks of life out solving really complicated problems.
I have a question on that graph, the emission of carbon dioxide and the level of sustainable carbon dioxide. Can you elaborate more on that, and how did they come to that number?
No. I took it on faith that the source I got it from was right. I didn't analyze how they figured it out, but what it's intended to mean was, in a steady state system where you've got so much CO2 emission and therefore so much sequestration, caused mostly by plant and algae growth, that amount of emission can be sequestered on an ongoing basis. But I didn't look at the research behind it to see if it's true. The point of the graph was,
Because you need to actually know with accuracy all the source and things, which actually some of the things that we were thinking is a source, there were sinks of CO2, and which we were thinking is a sink, turn out to be source. And global warming and climate change is not just CO2. We have found that, okay, methane also can be produced in conditions that we were thinking it won't be reduced, it won't be produced. So I think it's that number 3 really have to the question.
you have to question. Okay, here's my question to you. Western civilization is operating at about 12 overall tons, CO2 tons per person per year. Do you think that's sustainable?
I don't know.
I think the majority of the scientific community would say we can't sustain the level we're at. I don't know what the right answer is, but that was the only point of the graph.
I just wanted to make a comment. So I found it very encouraging, especially coming from someone with a technical background like yourself, to that you brought focus to this ethical dimension, or it might be sort of the root problem. Because I think as long as we don't, although the technological side, which has been mostly the focus of this conference, is very important, I think if we don't look to see, what's the root cause, that we're never going to really solve things. And it's maybe a good time for us to ask ourselves, why is our satisfaction or our happiness so connected to consuming? And that, if we manage to solve all these technological problems, and I got a little bit of the feeling that it wasn't so much a problem of technical innovation, but maybe political innovation and maybe changing people's mindsets. That's sort of really where the possibility lies for kind of a stable change. will we have no more problem? Will we be happy with our level of consumption, or will we just be driving ourselves?
And I think that's the human nature question. It isn't clear to me that we'll ever be happy with what we have. And I just think that's hardwired into the DNA. That what frightens me is that it is an ethical problem and therefore endlessly debatable. And gosh, I don't know how to solve that. If it's just a technical problem, that'd be great.
So I think this is a solvable problem, because not every country sort of is driven the way we are in the Western world. I mean, of course, many countries sort of aspire to that, but that's not the whole world. I would say that, that sort of, we are so set on that by nature, and it's fundamentally unresolvable. I think we should question that. I don't think that.
We absolutely should question it. We have to look in the mirror first and really, really analyze what we're doing and is it right. I've got friends that will say, yeah, you're probably right about this, but at the end of the day, it's a me first economy. And I've got to take care of mine and train my kids to take care of themselves. And these are really close friends of mine that know how much passion I have into stopping. It scares me that people think that way, but they do. And they aren't bad people. It's just how self-centered they are.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you bring that up at the end of the conference, that there's a real human and moral element to these questions, as well as the technical and the mathematical. So we're about to wrap up the conference. We have a number of visitors from out of town. We were able to support 18 people that come from all over the country and Canada to come to this conference. I would encourage all the students and grad students to meet up here afterwards in case you all want to go out to dinner together. You can make a plan to go down to the village. There's a lot of fun places, or you can walk up Foothill from the Doubletree and have a nice time and get to know each other, because you're all here from far and wide and you're all interested in the same kind of things. Okay? And I have to plead to you again for Suzanne to please turn your receipts in within a week, because that's my way of thanking her for all of the work she's done to make this conference possible, is that you guys get those receipts in. So, without further ado, thank you very much for coming, and let's thank the speaker again.